Right. Well, hello. John Bull on the Guadalquivir. Um, I don't, Dominic said he found this story really amusing, and so did my husband. So I hope you won't mind my take on it. Anyway, I imagine that we've all done something embarrassing at least once in our lives, and that we may possibly wake up in the night suddenly remembering an awkward incident from our past. If this is the case, then I can only say that I sincerely hope that none of us has behaved in the way that Trollope relates here. He wrote in his autobiography that this incident was based on one from his own past. If it was anything like that related here, I can only say, shame on you, Anthony. So, to the story. John Pumphrey is the son and heir in a business partnership with a Spanish family called d'Aguiar. Maria d'Aguiar, who has grown up in Spain, comes over to England and John falls in love with her within the 6 weeks of her stay. He is persuaded by both Maria and his parents that they should wait for a year before he should propose formally, and he reluctantly agrees, uncertain whether Maria is truly in love with him and slightly feeling that she is mocking him for being a bit young and silly. This is an important point because part of the moral of the story is that the narrator in the character of John Bull is rather a silly ass and not very self-aware. He blunders on and makes a fool of himself without realizing how much growing up he still has to do. On arriving in Spain, John is accompanied by another Englishman, Thomas, in whom he reposes complete trust, assuming that Thomas, after a year or so in Spain, knows all there is to know about Spain and the Spanish. It turns out this isn't quite the case as we reach the pivotal moment in the story. While John and Thomas are having a boring journey up the Guadalquivir towards Seville, they meet a man who dispels their boredom for a while. He is very fancifully dressed in what sounds like a really full-on Spanish outfit, the sort of clothes that a matador might wear, or perhaps one of those chaps in Strictly who's doing one of the Spanish dances. I can't think what it is. To make matters worse, he is whistling a tune from opera. Obviously, it should be, but alas, that was written in 1875, 14 years after this story. Perhaps it's this one from The Barber of Seville. You'll know it, Karen. Bit of the overture. Very apposite, as it turns out, when we learn his name. Our two chaps are intrigued by the Spaniard's rather splendid outfit, and the allegedly knowledgeable Thomas explains to our hero that the newcomer is a torero, or more probably, a sort of hanger-on at bullfights who is therefore quite low class. It is this assumption that encourages the two chaps to behave in a very inquisitive way. At first, Thomas just chats to the man and asks questions about his costume and what it's made of, while relaying the answers to John, who doesn't speak Spanish well. Despite the clear evidence that this is a very costly outfit, they continue with their arrogant assumption that the man has little money and even ask him how he can afford to dress in this way, speaking about him in English as an ass. There is a telling moment when Thomas is encouraged by John to tell him that he would be better off with a wife and a couple of babies. And the man's response is, he says that he'll think of it some of these days when he finds the supply of fools in the world is becoming short. Neither man appears to pick up on this inference. John finishes his intrusive examination of the man's outfit by managing to pull off a button from his coat. And it is at this point when he exclaims, "Oh, I'm so sorry," in English, that the man replies, "It do not matter at all." Even then, when it becomes clear that he is well educated enough to speak English, John persists in offering him money as if to a poor man. This is very politely refused in English, and the man walks away. Then, finally, John reflects on his behaviour and thinks of his gaucherie for a little while. We move to Seville, and the description of the d'Aguilar's house in Seville with its cool inner courtyard is so vivid that one can easily picture it. Perhaps it's because I'm a girl, but I struggled to understand the feelings with which John worried himself over Maria's reception and subsequent treatment of him. I think that his musings merely served to underline his own youth and callow outlook on life. His older, mature and contented self reflects on this. Poetry and romance, they are the splendid mountain views seen in the distance. So let men be content to see them and not attempt to tread upon the fallacious heather of the mystic hills. John has to accustom himself to not understanding when Maria speaks Spanish with her friends and not being able to link arms with her as he would in England. He also gets very jealous of a particular young man whom he takes to be a Spanish nobleman. So it is with some feelings of discontent that he gets up early one morning to visit the cathedral and the Giralda on the top of the tower with Maria. They meet a group of young Englishmen behaving rather badly, and while John wants to defend their behaviour, he can see that it isn't altogether defensible. He feels, though, that Maria is rude by calling them boys, and that she rather lumps him in with the boys by the way in which he feels she is treating him. He wisely decides, however, not to say anything while they are mounting the stairs. After all, one cannot speak with manly dignity while one is out of breath on a staircase. It is while they're admiring the view that John has a bit of a go about Maria's attitude to the English. And then out comes a story that she has just heard about two Englishmen who have made themselves ridiculous forever. Maria tells him the whole story about a marquis who met two Englishmen on a boat and gives details as to how he was dressed and what they did. But John is so blind that even then the blow did not strike home. It was only when she gave the date and the fact that the man spoke English that the blow fell. And John straightway appreciated the necessity of returning immediately to Clapham, where my family resided, and giving up forever all idea of Spanish connections. John makes his confession, but I think we're meant to understand that Maria already had a pretty good idea that it was him. For whom else could it be? However, confession is not only good for the soul, but also disarms reproof. So it was a good move, although to be fair, he didn't hesitate in making a clean breast of it. Of course, just at this moment, the Marquis appears on the rooftop, still in his fancy dress and still with a button missing. Maria behaves beautifully and introduces the two men. John is struck by her grace and beauty in the way she does this. I know it all, the whole story, but in spite of that, you must take him on my representation and be gracious to him in spite of what he has done. You must be content to do that, or in quarrelling with him, you must quarrel with me also. She, who not 5 minutes since had been loudly condemning the unknown Englishman for his rudeness, had already pardoned him now that he was known to be her friend, and had determined that he should be pardoned by others also, or that she would share his disgrace. After a little conversation about their earlier encounter, the Marquis gives John the button that he had pulled off and invites him to the splendid parties that he is about to give. Poor John is so abashed that he decides that everything is over for him. I should leave Seville as quickly as I could, and should certainly not again put myself in the way of the Marquis d'Almaviva. The name, of course, is the same as the hero of Barbara of Seville, who becomes the anti-hero in Figaro. So now we know which opera he was whistling. I had come out this morning, resolved to demand my rights and to exercise them, and now my only wish was to run away. I hated the Marquis and longed to be alone, that I might cast his button from me. To think that a man should be ruined by such a trifle. In his misery, he decides that Maria had merely put on a good front, but that once a Marquis had gone, her feelings of disgust and contempt had returned. He is all hurt dignity and assumes that she will break off their engagement. To him, the incident seems insuperable, but it turns out that Maria sees it merely as a little joke like that. This really brings out the difference between them and John's callousness in failing to have seen Maria's maturity. John is still a boy up to this point, but Maria is a grown woman. She will clearly bring out the best in John and help him to grow up. The last page of the story brings everything to a satisfactory conclusion. It turns out that the man of whom John has been jealous is one of the firm's clerks, who is married to one of Maria's friends. John goes to the Marquis's party as an honoured guest, and they become such firm friends that in the future, John and Maria name a child after him. From that day in which I ascended the Giralda to this present day in which I write, I have never once had occasion to complain of a deficiency of romance, either in Maria d'Aguiar or in Maria Pumphrey. This is a slight story with an almost woman's magazine love interest and ending, but of course the crux of the matter is the embarrassing incident on the boat. I get the very strong impression that Trollope wrote this as catharsis for himself, perhaps after he had had one of those sweaty nighttime awakenings in which his memory had amplified everything. How fortunate to be able to work it through in this way. Just a word on John Bull. John Bull has long represented the personification of the jolly, matter-of-fact, red-cheeked Englishman. He appears to have been invented by a chap called John Arbuthnot, who was a friend of Swift's, and Alexander Pope, being introduced in his satirical pamphlet, The Law is a Bottomless Pit. Arbuthnot then used the character in a much longer work that derided the War of the Spanish Succession. This is around sort of early 18th century. I think the pamphlet was written in 1712. The idea of John Bull was taken up by Hogarth and others, who made him into a sort of heroic archetype of the freeborn Englishman. Just as an ordinary type, fighting injustice, but only in a small parochial way. He comes to be depicted as a rather stout chap, often in a Union flag waistcoat and tailcoat, or perhaps as a huntsman. Then later in the 20th century, he became the dependable freedom-fighting character who would defend our shores to the death. If you want to know more about John Bull, there's an excellent In Our Time on the subject, and which is on the BBC iPlayer. So, to return to the story, I'm afraid that the light in which this story casts the Englishman abroad is not a good one, and I blush for my fellow countrymen. We all nowadays deplore the stories of drunkenness in Spain or at football matches abroad, and I've heard mutterings from some about how frightful cheap travel is in allowing all sorts of people to leave these shores for their holidays. I do wonder, though, if this is any worse than the casual assumptions of superiority in past centuries, or, further back, those younger sons who, having no inheritance, turned themselves into wandering groups of knights jauntering through France on chevauchés and dealing out a bit of rape and pillage on the way. O tempora, O mores. That's it.